Imagine a world where every person speaks the same language. No barriers, no misunderstandings. Every word understood, every idea shared instantly. Humanity moving as one. After the flood, people begin to spread across the earth again. Families grow, communities form. But something unusual happens. Instead of spreading out, humanity gathers together in one place. They decide to build something. Not just a city, a tower, a structure that will rise high into the heavens, a project driven by a single purpose, to make a name for ourselves. The work begins, bricks are formed, structures rise, the city grows. The tower reaches higher and higher, and for a moment, it seems like nothing can stop them. But then something unexpected happens. The biblical text describes a moment when God comes down to see what humanity is building, and what follows is sudden. Languages are confused. Communication breaks. The unity that once defined humanity disappears. People are scattered across the earth. The project stops. The tower remains unfinished. But why? Why would God interrupt something that appeared to unite humanity? What was happening in that moment that led to such a dramatic change? And what does this event reveal about the direction humanity was taking after the flood? To understand the Tower of Babel, we must return to the moment when humanity chose to build upward instead of spreading outward. Because the story of Babel is not only about a tower, it is about unity, intention, and the moment everything changed. Before we continue, if you enjoy exploring the deeper meaning behind the most powerful moments in the Bible, consider subscribing to the channel. Each episode in this series examines the text step by step, uncovering the context, the details, and the questions that have shaped the biblical narrative. Now let's return to the moment when humanity first gathered in one place with a single purpose. The account of the Tower of Babel begins with a simple but significant statement. The whole earth had one language and the same words. At this point in the narrative of Genesis, humanity shares a complete unity in communication. There are no linguistic divisions, no barriers of understanding. Every person is able to speak and understand the same language. As people move eastward, they find a plain in the land of Shinar and settle there. The text presents this movement as the beginning of a new stage in the development of human society after the flood. Communities are forming again. People are gathering together. A shared language allows them to act with coordination and purpose. It is within this setting that a decision is made. The people begin to speak to one another and propose a project. They say, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." The narrative highlights the materials they choose. Instead of using stone, they use baked bricks, and instead of mortar, they use bitumen. These details emphasize a deliberate and organized effort to build something that will endure. Then the purpose of the project is stated. "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth." This statement introduces the central intention behind the construction. The people are not only building a structure, they are acting with a shared goal to establish a name for themselves and to avoid being dispersed across the earth. The narrative presents this intention clearly, without commentary. The construction begins. The city rises. The tower is built upward. Humanity, unified by language and purpose, begins to accomplish what they have set out to do. At this point, the perspective of the story shifts. The text states that the Lord comes down to see the city and the tower that the children of man have built. This moment introduces a turning point in the narrative. God observes what humanity is doing and describes the situation in a particular way. They are one people, and they all have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. This statement acknowledges the power of human unity, but it also prepares for what is about to happen next, because the story does not continue with the completion of the tower. Instead, it moves toward an unexpected intervention. Come, let us go down, and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech. The change is immediate. Communication breaks. The unity that once defined humanity is disrupted. And as a result, the people are scattered across the earth, and the construction of the city and the tower comes to an end. The place is then given a name, Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. The narrative concludes by stating that from that place the people were dispersed over the face of the entire earth. Yet the central question remains: why did this happen? What was it about the building of the city and the tower that led to such a dramatic interruption? To understand the account of the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11, it is important to consider the events that immediately preceded in the narrative of Genesis. The story takes place after the flood described in Genesis chapters 6 through 9. Following the flood, Noah and his family emerge as the only human survivors. From them, the earth begins to be repopulated. Genesis chapter 9 records that God blesses Noah and his sons and gives them a command. They are instructed to be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. This command echoes the earlier instruction given at the beginning of Genesis, when humanity was first created. As the narrative continues into Genesis chapter 10, the text provides a genealogical record often referred to as the Table of Nations. This chapter describes how the descendants of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, spread out into different regions. The chapter repeatedly notes that these groups are organized according to their clans, languages, lands, and nations. This detail becomes significant when the narrative moves into Genesis chapter 11. Genesis 11 begins with the statement that the whole earth had one language and the same words. This description appears before the division of languages mentioned in the previous chapter. The narrative therefore presents a moment earlier in time, before the dispersion described in Genesis 10 has fully taken place. The people described in Genesis 11 travel together and settle in the land of Shinar. This region is associated with the area of ancient Mesopotamia, where early urban centers developed. The description of building with baked bricks and bitumen reflects construction methods known from that region. Within this setting, the people begin to organize themselves around a shared project. They decide to build a city and a tower. The stated purpose of this construction is important within the narrative. The people express a desire to make a name for themselves and to prevent being scattered across the earth. This intention stands in contrast to the earlier command given after the flood, in which humanity is instructed to spread and fill the earth. The account of the Tower of Babel therefore appears within a broader narrative movement in Genesis. The early chapters describe the creation of the world, the introduction of sin, the spread of humanity, and the judgment of the flood. After the flood, the story turns to the re-establishment of human society and the development of nations. The event at Babel takes place within this stage of the narrative, at a time when humanity is again increasing and organizing itself. The building of the city and the tower represents a moment when people choose to remain together in one place rather than continue spreading across the earth. The response described in the passage, the confusion of language and the scattering of people, leads directly to the outcome described in Genesis chapter 10, where nations are divided according to their languages and lands. Within the structure of Genesis, the Tower of Babel serves as a transition between the early history of humanity and the beginning of the narrative that will focus on Abraham in the chapters that follow. The dispersion of peoples across the earth sets the stage for the emergence of distinct nations and prepares the context for the next phase of the biblical story. The account of the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11 is brief, yet the structure of the passage contains several important details that shape the meaning of the narrative. The passage begins with a description of complete unity. The whole earth is said to have one language and the same words. This opening establishes a condition in which communication is fully shared among all people. There are no divisions or barriers, and this unity allows for coordinated action. The next movement in the text describes the migration of people as they travel eastward. They find a plain in the land of Shinar and settle there. The decision to settle marks a shift from movement to permanence. Once settled, the people begin to speak among themselves and propose a project. Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. The use of direct speech reveals an organized and collective decision. The narrative also highlights the materials used in the construction. The people choose baked bricks instead of stone and bitumen instead of mortar. These details emphasize intentional craftsmanship and a deliberate effort to build something durable. The purpose of the project is then stated clearly. Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered over the face of the whole earth. This statement contains two key elements. First, the desire to build a city and a tower that reaches toward the heavens. Second, the intention to establish a name for themselves and to prevent being scattered. The narrative presents these motivations without additional explanation, allowing the words themselves to define the purpose behind the construction. The perspective of the story then shifts. The text states that the Lord comes down to see the city and the tower that the children of man have built. This moment introduces a contrast between the human effort to build upward and the divine observation from above. God's response is expressed in direct speech. Behold, they are one people and they all have one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. This statement acknowledges the unity and potential of humanity. It also introduces the idea that the project represents the beginning of further actions. The passage continues with the declaration that nothing they propose to do will be impossible for them. Following this observation, a decision is made. Come, let us go down, and they confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech. The language of this statement mirrors the earlier words spoken by the people. Just as they said, "Come, let us build," the response now says, "Come, let us go down." The action that follows is immediate. The Lord confuses the language of the people. As a result, communication breaks down. The unified speech that defined the beginning of the passage is no longer present. Because of this, the construction of the city comes to an end. The people are then scattered from that place over the face of the whole earth. The narrative concludes by explaining the name given to the location. It is called Babel because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. From that place, the people were dispersed across the world. Through this sequence, the passage moves from unity to construction to divine intervention, and finally to dispersion. Each stage is presented in a concise and direct manner, allowing the events themselves to convey the development of the story. When the account of the Tower of Babel is examined closely, several observations emerge from the structure and wording of the text itself. One of the first elements to consider is the emphasis placed on unity at the beginning of the passage. The narrative states that the whole earth had one language and the same words. This condition allows the people to act together with a shared purpose. The text later reflects this unity again in the statement that they are one people with one language. This repeated emphasis suggests that unity plays a central role in the events described. Another observation appears in the stated intention of the people. Their words reveal two primary goals: to build a city and a tower that reaches toward the heavens, and to make a name for themselves. In addition to this, they express a desire to avoid being scattered across the earth. The text presents these motivations directly, without adding explanation. However, when placed alongside the earlier command in Genesis for humanity to fill the earth, The desire to remain in one place introduces a point of tension within the broader narrative. A further element of the passage is the shift in perspective when the Lord comes down to see the city and the tower. The text describes this moment in a way that contrasts human effort with divine observation. While the people are building upward, the narrative portrays God as coming down to view what has been constructed. God's statement in response to the situation highlights the potential that arises from human unity. The passage records that this is only the beginning of what they will do, and that nothing they propose will be impossible for them. This observation focuses attention on the combination of shared language and collective purpose. The decision that follows introduces the central action of the narrative. The Lord declares that their language will be confused so that they may not understand one another's speech. The result of this action is immediate. Communication breaks down, and the project can no longer continue. The scattering of the people across the earth becomes the final outcome. Another notable detail is the repetition of language within the passage. The words, "Come, let us," are first spoken by the people as they begin their project. Later, similar wording appears in the divine response. This parallel structure creates a contrast between human initiative and divine action. The naming of the place as Babel also carries significance within the narrative. The text explains the name by connecting it to the confusion of language that occurs there. This naming serves as a concluding explanation that ties the event to its outcome. Within the limits of the text, the account presents a sequence in which human unity leads to a shared project, followed by divine intervention that alters that unity. The passage does not provide extended commentary on the motivations or the implications beyond what is stated. Instead, it presents the events in a direct manner, allowing the structure and wording of the narrative to guide the reader's understanding. This prepares the way for the final reflections on what this moment represents within the broader story of Genesis. The account of the Tower of Babel carries important implications within the broader narrative of Genesis, particularly in relation to the development of humanity after the flood. One of the most immediate implications concerns the role of language in the organization of human society. At the beginning of the passage, the text describes a world in which all people share one language and the same words. This condition allows for complete unity in communication and enables coordinated action on a large scale. The events that follow demonstrate how this unity contributes to the construction of the city and the tower. The people are able to work together with a shared purpose, using common speech to plan and execute their project. The confusion of language introduced later in the passage changes this condition entirely. Communication is disrupted, and the ability to act together in the same way is removed. As a result, the project cannot continue, and the people are scattered across the earth. Another implication appears in the relationship between the actions of the people and the earlier command given in Genesis after the flood. In Genesis chapter 9, humanity is instructed to multiply and fill the earth. In Genesis chapter 11, the people express a desire to remain together and avoid being scattered. This contrast highlights a tension within the narrative. The intention of the people, as stated in their own words, moves in a different direction from the earlier command. The outcome of the passage, the scattering of the people, results in a distribution of humanity across the earth, which aligns with the broader movement described in Genesis chapter 10, where nations are divided according to their lands and languages. Another important implication concerns the shift in the structure of the Genesis narrative that follows this event. After the account of Babel, the text moves away from a focus on humanity as a whole and begins to concentrate on a specific individual. Genesis chapter 12 introduces Abraham. This transition marks a change in the narrative. Instead of describing the development of the entire human population, the story begins to follow a particular family line through which the next stage of the biblical narrative will unfold. The event at Babel therefore functions as a turning point between the early history of humanity and the beginning of the story centered on Abraham. The passage also highlights the relationship between human action and divine response. The people initiate the construction of the city and the tower with a clearly stated purpose. The response that follows comes from the Lord, who observes the situation and acts in a way that alters the course of the project. The narrative presents this sequence without extended explanation, but the structure shows that the outcome of the event is directly connected to the actions that preceded it. Within the broader context of Genesis, the Tower of Babel stands as a moment in which unity, intention, and outcome are closely connected. The world that began with a single family after the flood moves into a stage where humanity is organized into different languages and nations. This prepares the narrative for the next development in the biblical story, where the focus shifts to the unfolding of the promises that will begin with Abraham. The story of the Tower of Babel begins with unity. One language, one people, one shared purpose. Humanity gathers together in a single place and begins to build. A city rises, a tower reaches upward. The intention is clear: to make a name for ourselves and to prevent being scattered. And for a moment, it appears that nothing can stop them. The work progresses, the structure grows, the project moves forward. Then the narrative shifts. The Lord comes down to see the city and the tower. The unity that once defined humanity is acknowledged. They are one people, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. But the story does not continue toward completion. Instead, everything changes in a single moment. Language is confused. Communication breaks. The shared understanding that once connected humanity disappears. The construction stops. The people are scattered across the earth. The city remains unfinished, and the place receives a name that reflects what happened there: Babel. Because there the language of the whole earth was confused. Within the narrative of Genesis, this moment becomes a turning point. The unified humanity described at the beginning of the chapter becomes a world divided into languages and nations. The scattering of the people prepares the stage for what comes next in the biblical story, because immediately after this event, the focus of Genesis shifts. The narrative no longer follows humanity as a whole. Instead, it begins to follow a single individual: Abraham. From that point forward, the story moves from the dispersion of nations to the beginning of a promise that will unfold through one family. If you enjoy exploring passages like this and examining how each moment fits into the larger story of Scripture, consider subscribing to the channel. This series is walking step by step through the Bible, uncovering the meaning behind the most important and mysterious events recorded in the text. Because sometimes the most significant turning points in the story happen in moments where everything changes at once, and the division that begins at Babel is only the beginning of what comes next. In the next episode, the story moves forward to the moment when one man is called out from among the nations, and through him, a new chapter of the biblical narrative begins.